So our speaker today is Jane Plitt, an accomplished businesswoman, consultant, and author. She is a graduate of Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Jane began her career as the first female management trainee with Rochester Telephone as a staff assistant in labor relations. In 1973, she left Rochester Telephone to become the executive director of the National Organization for Women. Thereafter, Jane went into the consulting business and developed an award-winning consulting practice. She began writing as a visiting scholar at the University of Rochester and published several award-winning books she's going to talk to us about today. And which, by the way, she has set up some of the books here on a table for those of us who are interested in seeing those. And so please join me in welcoming Jane as our speaker today. Jane?
Hi everyone, I'm delighted to be here. Those of you that are on Zoom can't see that I'm short. But since we are, thank you Judge, thank you Janine, thank you Sharon, thank you Mac. It takes a team in order for me to be here, and I'm really, really appreciative. Because we are in a theater, and because the topic deals with suffrage, I thought I needed a prop. So I'm going to put on what says, and I don't know if it's visible, Votes for Women, which was the banner that many supporters, men and women, wore in order to finally get women the right to vote. I wanted to set the stage. How am I doing, Janine? This is the right terminology. I wanted to set the stage for what it would have been like and why this story of Matilda Harper needed the support of the suffrage movement and of the two key women, Susan B. Anthony and Bertha Parker. I came across a statement that Reverend Peters of Baltimore, I hope no one is a family relative, but it was entitled, What the Suffrage Would Do for Women. And it said, would a woman's vote alter things? Yes, if only good women vote. Few good women would avail themselves of the privilege, but all the bad women would. If you give women the ballot, she must be ready to turn policeman and serve on a jury. Get ready, Judge. The responsibilities which logically follow this advance of woman mean that henceforth she will not be represented by any man, and exercising the full functions of citizenship would make such a change as would make her more a man than a woman. So, let us begin with our presentation. So what I want to talk about today is how Susan B. Anthony, Bertha Parker, and the whole suffrage movement helped to launch the fastest growing segment of retailing today, which is modern retail franchising. And it's the story of a servant girl who became, but forgotten, the mother of modern franchising. And who was Bertha Parker? Well, many of us know. We do not know that she was the woman who encouraged modern franchising. She was also, as many of us do know, a dynamite. She was a society lady. She, here in our area, was a major developer and visionary, and her concepts for irrigation for the agriculture down here were path blazing. Susan B. Anthony. She was a leader, one of many, of the suffrage movement. She was a Quaker and a Unitarian Universalist, and she was headquartered in Rochester, New York. This is the tale of 3 lives, one rich, one poor, one activist. They all had a commitment to women. They were all very determined ladies. 2 had the same middle name, Matilda. 2 married, Susan did not. Bertha married and became more enriched. Martha married and was, well, you'll hear, was enriched by marrying a younger man. And they died at very different ages. Bertha relatively young at 69, but Susan and Martha lived to almost 93. So the story begins in Oakville, Ontario. This was the home of Martha Matilda Harper with her 5 other siblings and her parents. It was essentially a 1.5 room meager cabin. And at that time, if you were born in that area and you were on the wrong side of the tracks, which they were, life was pretty bleak. And here's a photo of Martha's mother, Beatty, and her sister, Emma. And if we look at Beatty, we get the sense of how bleak life was. And then Martha comes along, in which it's essential that if you're going to survive poverty, you need to have a dream. And I like this photo because it captures a sense with her eyes of a hopefulness. But unfortunately, her father, Robert, was a lazy man, and he bound out each of his children to work. And Martha is bound out and indentured as a servant at age 7 and sent 60 miles away, which is today like being sent to Mars. She was not to see her family again. And in this situation, there you have this young child trying to figure out how to cope. And it is clear that she was very determined to break out of servitude. We see her here as a young servant woman, and at the time, women had very limited rights. A father, a man, could determine the fate of his children, and the mother had no power. The women in Canada, as well as in the United States, had no rights when they married to retain property. And Martha is imagining, what's my way out? And the only option she could see was marriage. And she says, that isn't going to do me any good. Look at my mother. She has no rights. But her last Canadian employer was a holistic doctor from Germany who taught her about healthy hair care and had her brushing her hair, something that was very unusual in the Victorian era. And more unusual was washing your hair, which was really innovative. And he had a hair tonic recipe that he shared with Martha, and on his deathbed, he bequeaths it to Martha, and she seizes it. With that formula, she thinks she has a possibility of changing her life. And she crosses Lake Ontario and comes to Rochester, which I believe was absolutely key to her ultimate success. In Rochester, with the Erie Canal, it was bringing a whole slew of people with different ideas, people who were weird, who would think about, as you can see, the third picture is George Eastman, how to create photography, Bausch and Lomb, how to use the technical skills that they were bringing from Germany. But the gentleman on my left is Frederick Douglas. And he's brought to Rochester by a group, small, but determined social activists who were Quakers. And he's brought to Rochester to publish the North Star and to advocate against slavery. Susan B. Anthony and her family arrive, and they are part of that abolitionist movement, and she is also part of a movement that begins to think about when the women went to England and were denied the right to sit with the men and to be heard on the topic of anti-slavery. Those advocates, female advocates, begin to think about women's rights. And the gentleman all the way over was a congressman, and he ends up representing the Susan B. Anthony in the famous court case in which she dared to vote. Well, we know, or some of us know, that Susan, quote, illegally voted, but so did 14 other women from Rochester, which is my point. This was a community that was mobilizing and in which men and women were supporting the possibility that women had rights and certainly had the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony, when she voted, said, well, I have been and gone and done it. Positively voted. So we are in for a fine agitation in Rochester. And the reason she and the 14 other women were able to vote was John Van Voorhees was the counsel to the Board of Election, and he said, yes, let them register to vote. Susan B. Anthony understood that for women to have equality, for sure they needed the vote, but they also needed a pocketbook. They needed the economic means to control their lives. And she stated, I hope that a constantly increasing number of women will earn their own living instead of marrying men with whom it is impossible to live. Now I have to pause here. My husband's over there, and I've been married for 48 years, so it is not impossible to live with all. Thank you. To understand the dynamic and the fabric of some of those women, we look beyond Susan. And her sister, Mary Anthony, is a perfect example. She refused to become a principal because the school district was unwilling to pay her the same salary as a man. But when they found out that the male they ended up hiring was not effective, they went back to Mary and said, well, we would really like to hire you. And she said, well, you know the terms, I get the same amount of pay. And so she was the first woman to be paid equally in Rochester. She also refused to pay taxes on her home, where Susan B. Anthony co-lived, until she had the right to vote. And what she wrote every year was, taxation without representation is not what I will support. So you begin to sense that this unique community at the time is bubbling over with a willingness to embrace weirdos. And you got Susan B. Anthony, who is deeply influencing it, and you got this John Van Voris. He's an enlightened attorney, and he's the former congressman, and he's society. And then Martha Matilda Harper comes to Rochester, becomes a servant there, but observes that where the society people are is at the Powers Building. It is where they bank, it is where the lawyers are, and it is where there is an art gallery, and people, particularly women, can bring their children for musical lessons. And Martha has this idea that she can take what she has been taught and that formula and create the first beauty salon in Rochester. How will she do it? Well, basic business, you capitalize on your assets. And what would an asset be if you've been a servant for a long time? One, we know her hair. This is a real picture. A photographer took it, and she said, you can take my picture, but I get a copy. And she posted that on what would be her first office at Salon. Now, I skipped a point. That Powers Building was run by Daniel Powers. And Daniel was very concerned about image. And when Martha approached Daniel about the prospect of opening the first beauty salon for women, he of course said, oh gosh, no, I can't imagine. It would attract the prostitutes and trollops, no way. But Martha, and we begin to see this community connecting, Martha calls on John Van Voris and says, I want to hire you, and does. And said, here's my concept, I need to be in that building. And one can imagine the conversation. John says to Daniel, Danny, let her in. And Daniel Powers would say, no way. And John said, do it for me. And Powers says, I'll do it on one condition. And that is, there will be no lease. I have the right to throw her out because I know it's going to attract the wrong kind. And so she agrees, and she's in. And now that becomes the first advertisement. And we can see Martha's brain working because she even creates a logo. And it's that horn of plenty. And it has a secret code to it that's in her head, which is feed yourself, free yourself. It's what she's thinking for herself. But having been the servant for 25 years, she knows that it is essential to build everything on service and delighting your customer. So what does she do? She's going to create this new concept, but if she brings women in and they have to have their hair washed, and the soap gets in their eye because they're going to lean over a sink and it messes their fancy garb, it isn't going to fly. So she invents the first reclining shampoo chair. And if you notice the sink, it's carved out for the neck. The place I go to today does not have that. So she delights people, and it creates buzz. And Grace Coolidge comes to Rochester because she cares about the School of the Deaf. And she's absolutely enamored with Martha. And here's a picture of Martha later on in a hotel room that Grace is filled with flowers because our First Lady Coolidge will only use the Harper method. And Grace Coolidge's friend is Bertha Palmer. And this is how the network spreads. Bertha is a networker, and she is about to head the women's division of the 1893 Chicago World Columbian Fair. And she falls in love with the Harper method. So she wants to promote women, and here she says women as a sex have been liberated. They now have time to think and be educated and to plan. And so this is Bertha's thinking in 1892, and she's looking at this brilliant business concept, and she wants a shop in Chicago. Women became a new focus. They had the Women's Pavilion in 1893. Bertha says to Martha, I want to shop in Chicago. And Martha has to agree. But Martha has to figure out how the heck would she expand and finance it. And we begin to see the innovation of Martha continues. She says to Bertha, if you want me to come, then bring back a petition of 25 of your best friends that they will patronize me. So Bertha delivers. That was not a problem. But the real problem is, how will Martha expand? She isn't able to get bank financing. Venture capital for women was not going to happen. So she thinks outside the box. And she comes up with this concept, looking at the model of Christian Science, where a woman is the head, has a mother church, and there are satellite churches operating all over the country, and in fact the world. And they all follow the dictates of the mother church. Martha decides to replicate that. She did not know that the French word franchise means to free yourself from servitude, but it's exactly what she did. She was able to capitalize on other poor women and have them become her franchise owners. And here, if you could see the sign, it says, founded by a woman for women. And if we can go back to one slide, what Martha's approach was every shop would be standardized. Training would be standardized, they'd have to be certified, and she was going to win customer loyalty and niche market and guarantee jobs. And she goes on one more step. She says the first 100 of what would ultimately be 500 shops around the world, including here in Sarasota, 5 training schools and 2 manufacturing centers, the first 100 shops have to go to poor women so that they can change their economic control. And here's a sample of one in Santa Barbara, and the next one shows Martha visiting in Germany, the 2 franchise owners. And now, Martha decides that She's in control, she's made a lot of money, and she is charmed by Robert McBain, who is 24 years younger than she is. But if she marries him, she has a trophy, and she has a useful helpmate. So she marries Robert McBain. This is a time when the beauty industry is beginning to pop, and men have taken over, and there are people, Charles Revson takes over and creates a Revlon, and there the slogan is, we need to have women believe that they can buy beauty in a jar. Martha believes in differentiating and defining herself. She's someone who believes in organic, wholesome products. And she believes that health is beauty and that the role of the Harper shop is to bring out the inner beauty of everyone. And she expands it to include men, yes. She also believes in treating staff well. And she believes and she tells the shop owners, you have to meet with your staff often and they get the first item on the agenda. Listen to them first and treat them with respect, foster loyalty, and provide opportunities to be together, to market creatively. And here we see Martha moves into, in the later 1920s and 30s, into department stores. And here we see Jordan Marsh in Boston promoting their 90th year and promoting the Harper method. But indicative of the times, it was not all one when the suffrage was achieved, because in 1935, Fortune did a 3-part article on whether women were ready for the executive chair. And even though you've got Martha Matilda Harper with her 500 shops worldwide, Helena Rubinstein, Estee Lauder, they conclude that these are not real businesses. The money is real, but these are women's businesses. And therefore they conclude that a woman's place is not in the executive chair. Martha ignores all of it and just continues doing what she does. But she also believes it's important to acknowledge and celebrate your achievements. And here in 1922, we see the new Harper headquarters. And if you could see what the inscription is on that front of the facade of the building, it has Martha's name, Martha Matilda Harper, and that building still stands with Martha's name on it. In 1938, she's celebrating 50 years, and she brings in all of the Harper franchises, and you see them assembled in Martha's backyard, which is a large mansion garden area. And the portrait of Martha is drawn and presented, and they said it will end up in the Smithsonian. When I was speaking on Wisconsin Public Radio about Martha, I got a phone call and it said, I think I have the portrait. And it ended up having been in an antique store that this woman purchased, and she said, my husband couldn't stand her eyes. They kept staring at her. Fortunately, that portrait and all the archives that I discovered crisscrossing the United States and Canada are now safely at the Rochester Museum and Science Center.
Good.
On the 60th anniversary, Martha is there waving, but she is suffering from dementia. And her husband, who is to her side, and the other gentleman have now taken over the leadership. And it changes the complexion of this esprit de corps of women for the Harper business. Here we see Martha's tombstone, and it talks to you. We see her name, we see the acknowledgement in smaller letters of her husband, but we don't see mention of the Harper Empire, but what we do see are the cornucopia, her logo. So it was a subtle way of acknowledging her tie-in, but because she lied about her age and felt awkward with Robert, you don't see boldly printed when she was born and when she died, but it's in very small print below. And what you also see is that little in-ground tombstone is Robert. He had been in World War I, and he was a captain, and it was the high point of his life was to have achieved that. And so he chose that rather than taking away from Martha. And I think what it says to me is he was always in her shadow. Someone, when we took that photo, must have visited from Canada because the Canadian flag is there. And so, Martha's story was buried until I happened to stumble across a little article about it as I was working for a client in that Powers building. And I am very proud that Sir Harold Evans, in his book, They Made America, cites Harper as one of 60 entrepreneurs who changed America. He made a TED Talk about Martha and franchising, and Martha has been inducted since the Harper book is out into the National Women's Hall of Fame and the National Business Hall of Fame. And so I hope that you remember women and you remember the linkage to Rochester, and that most of all you remember Martha. And I hope that whether you are male or female, young or old, you understand that what she modeled was that we all can dare to dream and we can all do good. And I thank you very much, and I encourage you to look at the books and pass them on. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For being here, and it's tradition at Kiwanis to provide you and give you a gift of golden ruler to measure your future success. So please, thank you for being here.